Hello. So today is Friday, March 26th, and this is ECE 637, Digital Image Processing 1. And today we're going to cover, we're going to finish up sort of gamma correction and get into some human visual system modeling, okay? And then we'll hopefully pretty soon, or I'm going to try to pick up the pace because we have a lot of material to cover. So, and we'll try to get into color imaging, okay? So, any questions? I'm just trying to think. Is there anything? The exam. Oh, I know one thing. The final exam, as a number of you were kind enough to point out, has not been scheduled. I'm not exactly sure why. It might have been some kind of oversight, or it's possible there was something I was supposed to do that I didn't do, but in the past I've never done anything. It just got scheduled. But in any case, regardless, I emailed them and they're scheduling it. So it's actually scheduled. Hold on. I might be able to tell you when it is. Let's put it on my calendar. It should have synced up across my phone. Hold on. It's May, right? Oh, okay. So you can write this down. Okay, maybe I'll just write it on here. Okay. Final exam. Final exam is 1 p.m. This is Eastern Daylight Time, so that's New York time. Oops. And it's May 5th, 2021. Okay? And there's no room schedule because it'll be on Gradescope. Okay? Gradescope. / Zoom. Okay, so there was at least one person for which there was some confusion. They didn't understand that when they do the exam, they were supposed to do Zoom along with Gradescope. So you're supposed to, just to review, we use Gradescope. We're going to do what I'm going to call, okay, we're going to do a synchronous exam, okay? So, there may be some people for which this time is not won't work, and those people would likely be in the online section. So, if this time is not, if you look, I know that I'm teaching 2 classes this semester, so I get them mixed together, and so don't. I'm not intentionally trying to forget. Okay, I just genuinely can't remember whether there was people in this class for which I was a bad choice. I think there might have been some people in, like, maybe Japan or something like that. I can't remember. Okay, so email me. I'll make an announcement. If this time, I'll set up a second time, but it'll basically be synchronous, okay? Because I feel, and then what we'll do is Zoom, okay? So here's the thing. At least one person didn't realize about the Zoom and took the exam without the Zoom. Okay, that's fine. It was an honest error and so forth. But here's the thing. It put that student at a disadvantage because what happened is that I answered questions during that thing, okay? And the student didn't know. So the student then didn't have access to that information. So do the Zoom for your own benefit, okay? In addition to the fact that it's a requirement, I'm asking that everybody do it, okay? I thought it worked out pretty well last time because it gave more the feeling of an in-class exam. So is that okay with everybody else? All right, good. So that's one thing. Any other questions? So last time we were talking about perceptually uniform color spaces, the standard thing people do is take the energy. Y is proportional to energy, so they take the quantity is proportional energy, and they raise it to the p, and that yields approximately perceptually uniform color space, because fixed steps in L represent fixed perceptual steps. Okay, now, you know, I'm presenting the truth in layers, okay? So actually it's going to turn out that what I'm saying here isn't exactly true, okay? It's sort of approximately true. I'll give you a more precise specification what really is exactly true later. But this is approximately true. So you raise it to the p, okay? And in the limit as p goes to 0, this looks like a log. But the advantage of raising it to the p is that you then have something which is strictly positive, so you don't want to have to deal with negative quantities. And the two values of p, or the values of p that are sort of widely used, is p equals 1/3. That's sort of widely accepted as the best empirical fit to human perceptual data. And the reason that it's kind of widely accepted is that we'll see later that there's a thing called there's kind of a widely accepted model of human color perception. It's not super accurate, but it's kind of widely accepted, and it's called the LAB color space, okay? So anybody who's dealt with color images probably has heard of LAB. It's how you measure color in commercial applications that's widely used. And LAB is based upon this idea of p equals 1/3. We'll talk about it later. So roughly speaking, I mean, if you actually take data and you try to fit it, it's pretty messy, okay? So there isn't a single totally clear answer to these questions, but that's kind of widely accepted as being a pretty good fit. People won't argue with you if you do that, okay? You know, it's the conventional wisdom, you might say. So, but in real applications, okay, like for example, if you have a JPEG compressed image, the default value of p is 2.2, 1/2.2. And you say, well, why 2.2? Well, I don't know. It sort of got baked into the standards pretty early on. And 1/2.2, does somebody have a calculator? It comes out to about 0.41 is my recollection. So people actually, I think 0.41 may be the actual standardized value as opposed to 1/2.2. So later on we'll talk about standards. And then there's a thing called gamma correction. Gamma correction is exactly this, okay? And so in standard gamma correction, you can use any value of gamma you choose. Like, for example, if you go into the monitor, like if you have a monitor, usually if you go into the menus, the calibration menus, into a monitor, if it's a reasonably good monitor, it'll allow you to set the gamma for the monitor, okay? So, the default will usually be 1/2.2, okay, which is, or it'll be 2.2 is the value of gamma, and then that'll be sort of the default. But if you want to change it, you can. And effectively what will happen is that, we'll talk about this in a minute, but as you change gamma, you'll effectively change the contrast of the image. Right? So sometimes they'll just talk about that as being contrast. Or there's a lot of standards we'll talk about. NTSC video, which is almost an archaic standard at this point. There's very little analog NTSC video left. But NTSC video, while it's sort of not widely used anymore because it's analog, it does affect other standards, which sort of are backward compatible with it. And there's a thing called sRGB. We'll talk about that pretty extensively. That uses 2.2. Standard PC and Unix displays use 2.2. It used to be that the Macintosh displays use 1.8. And the reason they did that is because it would sort of make the colors more sort of stand out a little bit, make the display brighter. But I think now that Apple's really gone to 2.2 also in order to be compatible with the rest of the world. And then, as I talked about earlier, there's this thing called the LAB color space, visually uniform color space, and it uses a value of 1/3. Okay. Also, gamma correction. Gamma correction is kind of interesting because it's in the old days it kind of grew out of a need. Okay. In the old days, in the early days of TV, it was kind of interesting. That the television was mostly okay. I'm not okay. My view of television might be a little bit, Amerocentric, you might say. I think there were like parallel efforts in other countries, maybe in Europe and so forth. But certainly, one of the drivers of television was a company called RCA. How many people have heard of the company RCA? Okay, so it lives on. Okay, interesting. Okay, it hasn't existed for a long time because it got bought by GE. Okay, and then there was a company called the Victor Company, which started the Victrola. Okay, have people heard of Victrolas? Okay, yeah, those are those things with the original records. Before LPs, and they were made out of this like brittle material. You could hit it and it would shatter into pieces. And there was no electronic amplification, so that the needle just vibrated, and it mechanically created the sound. And that, if you've ever heard like one of these old sounds, like these old records, they have like a characteristic sound to them, which you associate with the 1920s. That's a Victrola. And then I think Thomas Edison was at least claimed to have invented the phonograph on discs, but he claimed to invent a lot of things. It was a little unclear exactly who invented everything. But and then the Victrola company got bought by RCA. I think RCA had an interesting background. It was sort of almost set up by the government as, or at least the government played a big role in it. And then so it was the Victor Company. Okay. And then, there was this thing, I'm really getting into old memorabilia. There was this thing that, there was this bot dog, and it was listening to Victrola, and that was like their symbol of RCA or so forth. And then RCA, so they basically, and then there was this guy named, what's his name? Sarnoff, okay? Has anybody heard of Sarnoff? Okay, so Sarnoff was sort of like, okay, this is actually getting a little dated, but it's a little bit like the Bill Gates of his time, okay, or maybe more. I'm just trying to think of who he was, like sort of a combination of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, I guess. So Sarnoff basically ran RCA, and he made boatloads of money because the big technology they invented was broadcast radio, okay? I think I mentioned this, right? Broadcast is like what the farmers did. They threw the seeds. So this was an amazingly innovative idea that you would just give this stuff away and somehow you would make money. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense that, I'm going to just play this. I'm going to play radio stations on the air and people will just listen for free. And somehow I can make money. Oh, because I'll have advertising. Okay, so that was like a breakthrough concept, and of course they were making boatloads of money. Okay, and they were trying to distribute radio, and then they were like, well, we wouldn't have like a visual version of radio, so we're going to have like television. Okay, so they invented television, and the guy who was behind the invention of both radio and television for RCA was this guy named Armstrong, who invented FM modulation, okay, frequency modulation. And then they invented the basic concept of like, this is NTSC video, which you got to give credit to NTSC video standard. It's like, we were like, oh, that's old, but hey, it like survived as a standard for like 70 years. That's pretty good. Most standards don't hold up that long. So with NTSC video, basically you have an analog signal that goes across like this and draws on the screen like an Etch-a-Sketch. Everybody knows what an Etch-a-Sketch is, right? Yeah, it draws on the screen like this, and you modulate the intensity of the electron beam, and the electron beam hits the phosphor on the surface of the screen, and the phosphor, through a fluorescing process, produces light. Okay, so you can control the brightness on the screen, and you basically draw on the screen. Okay, and the standard has it does interlace scanning, so it does every other line. So it does every other line like this. Okay, and then what happens? That there's like what's half of 480? Is that 290? No, that's 240. Okay, so it draws 240 lines. Okay, because I can't divide. It draws 240 lines, and then what happens is it comes back and it redraws the lines halfway in between. That's called interlaced video. Okay. So you have what's called two fields, each of which is alternate lines. You have the even and the odd lines, okay? And then so you get 240 of these, so you get a total of 480. And today we refer that as to 480i. Excuse me, I had my COVID shot, so okay. So you get 480i, okay? And so you get 480 lines. Now, in terms of the resolution spatially, horizontally, that depends on the analog nature of the signal. So there's a certain amount of bandwidth, and they would specify, but in a modern TV, they talk about the number of pixels because it's digital, and you actually have pixels across. But here it was just analog scanned, okay? So that's fine. So the point is that now, okay, so in the early days of the 1930s, this is actually before the Second World War, they were working on the details of how to make a TV, okay? And they defined all these standards, and they did some amazing work. A lot of what we'll talk about in this section was all done in the 1930s in terms of characterizing human visual system. How are they going to make it color? The initial TVs were what they called black and white. They were achromatic. They just, okay? When I was a kid, nobody had a color TV. So my friend who lived on the corner, his father worked for NBC. Oh, NBC was owned by RCA. So people have heard of NBC. Oh, yeah, NBC still exists, right? Yeah. Okay, so you heard of NBC, right? The National. Well, NBC was just a subsidiary of RCA, okay? And that was the subsidiary that they used to actually market their technology for TVs, okay? And that was the broadcast version of that. But what ended up happening is that when NBC kind of got spun, I guess when GE bought RCA, they merged, then NBC was owned by GE, but now I guess GE sold off NBC. I don't even know who owns NBC anymore. But anyway, so what happened is that they, in the 1930s, they defined all this. They figured it all out. They were super smart. You know, when you go back and you look at what people did, it was amazing. What they were able to accomplish with, you know, they didn't have computers and all this stuff, but they were able to figure all this stuff out and make it all work, but it was all analog. There was no digital, okay? It was all analog. So how do they make it work? Well, they had to have some way of capturing the picture. So this is how you display the picture. How do you capture the picture? So what they did for capturing the picture is they kind of reversed the entire process. They had a thing called a Vidicon tube. Okay, a Vidicon tube. And the Vidicon tube was basically like a TV run in reverse. So they displayed, they had the light impinge on the surface of the display. And then what would happen is they had a physical process by which when the light hit it, it emitted electrons basically, or at least it somehow changed the surface so that then they could sense the amount of light that it hit the phosphor by looking at the current flow and in the tube. But these are vacuum tubes. A CRT, okay, CRTs are still used by like gamers because the digital TVs have too high latency. The analog TVs are very low latency, right? So video gamers use them. You guys have seen CRT. You know what a CRT looks like, right? So a CRT is basically a big vacuum tube, and it fires an electron beam at the screen, and then the electron beam is scanned across by using an electric field to steer it, right? Because the electrons, can be steered by an electric field because they have charge on them, right? And so, okay, so you do the same thing with the Vidicon tube, only in reverse. You scan across the screen, and at each point you can measure the amount of light that's hit that point of the Vidicon tube. Okay, so in the old days they had a Vidicon tube, so it was all analog. There was no digital. You couldn't store anything. It was all real time. And by the way, the original TV shows were all live, okay? Like the Lucille Ball show, okay? Everybody, how many people have heard of Lucille Ball? Does anybody know who Lucille Ball? Okay, at least one person. Actually, do you know Desilu Productions? Have you ever heard of Desilu Productions? That was Lucille Ball started one of the first production companies, right? She had a very famous, popular TV show called The Lucille Ball Show, and she started Desilu Productions. And guess what TV show was produced by Desilu Productions? I'm really going off into a tangent here, but it's fantastic. Star Trek, okay? So Star Trek was created by Lucille Ball. I just want you to know that, okay? At least, and she must have hired Gene Roddenberry. Okay, anyway, so, okay, it's very interesting. So, anyway, so there's no digital here. It all has to go, it's like fresh food. You got to ship it before it goes rotten, okay? It's all got to get there in time, can't be stored, no refrigeration. So you got to get the data from here to here, and it's got to display properly on the CRT. So what are you going to do? Okay, so you got this Vidicon tube. The thing that's interesting about the Vidicon tube is it turns out that the Vidicon tube, because it's basically a CRT in reverse, the Vidicon tube has the reverse response of the CRT. And the CRT has the following effect, that if you as you modulate the input to the CRT, I made you use, okay, we'll call it X. So as you put, this is the CRT. Oh, by the way, if you want to see what a CRT looks like, how many people here ever get coffee in the HCAN lounge? Okay, maybe in the days of COVID, you don't go there as much. But there's a place called the HCAN lounge. Does everybody know what the HCAN lounge is? Okay, it's you should go there, okay? They have really inexpensive Starbucks coffee. And it's in the basement of the ECE building, right? And if you look up on the ceiling, you'll see CRT tubes. Those are the original CRT tubes made by this guy called Roscoe George, which was one of the original professors here in ECE, who built one of the first TV sets, okay? And that's how come we have the Zorkin medals. So Zorkin was basically a friend of this guy Sarnoff, okay? So, so there's a lot of history associated with Purdue, but you can look at the CRT tubes, okay? They're really cool. Go get a cup of coffee and watch them. Okay, so then the input here is X, okay? But the actual light that comes out is I. Oops, okay, it's I. So the interesting thing is here, that I, you might think would be proportional to X, but it's not. It's proportional to X to some power, okay? And the power is around 2.2. And I like to think of it this way, that the X here is the voltage of the incoming signal. That the voltage, that what ends up happening is the energy of the light that's sent out is proportional to the voltage squared. It kind of makes sense, right? So the energy, this is energy, and this is voltage, is approximately equal to the voltage squared. Not exactly. But interestingly enough, the Vidicon tube had exactly the same response, but in reverse. So in this case, the output here was the light intensity raised to the power 1 over 2.2. So that was fortunate because this thing here and that thing there have the reverse responses, so they cancel each other out. And that was called gamma correction, okay? Now, the thing that happened is that when people first started to say, okay, we're going to do this digitally, by the time they got to the like 19, 80s, say, maybe a little bit before that, they were thinking, oh, we want to try to do this digitally because that would be good. Of course, it was very difficult to do it digitally in the 80s. Like, you had to have, like, it was like now you just do it on your cell phone, you watch a video, it's like nothing. In the 1980s, you had to buy you'd spend like $100,000 for a special monitor which could display these images, okay? But so it was very challenging. But they were going to digitize it. So the first tendency was to say, oh, well, we'll take the signal and we'll take away that kind of weird response that this Vidicon tube has and store it in units which are proportional to energy. And then we'll display it in the units that are proportional to energy. We'll just take this and correct for the nonlinearity of the CT. So in other words, they tried to correct for the nonlinearity of the acquisition and display device, okay? And guess what? That didn't work very well. Why? Because if you quantize the image digitally in coordinates that are linear, what happens? You get contours in the block regions. Oh my God, this is wonderful. It's like the first time I've actually gotten the answer right up front, okay? It's just wonderful, okay? You get contours in the dark regions, okay? Oh my God, you made my day. Pitter patter goes my heart. So, you get contours in the dark regions, okay? So you don't want to do that. So guess what they did? They decided, oh, you know what? This is fine. We'll actually add that nonlinearity digitally. So it could be just like the original nonlinearity we got in the analog devices. So they call that gamma correction. So basically gamma correction is just like a digital simulation of what the analog systems did automatically in the old days, okay? So what they do is you take the image, the incoming image, you normalize it by the maximum intensity of the light that you're going to have so that this thing now goes between 0 and 1. And then you raise it to the 1 over gamma, where gamma is 2.2. So I like to think about gamma as being approximately 2 because it's easier for me to think about a square root. So a square root function is going to look like this. The square root, so what will happen is you have I in and you have x out. Right? And it's going to be like a square root, so it's going to look like this. Because that's what a square root looks like, right? It's like a square function tipped on its side. So, so what will end up happening then? And then the output, you have to reverse that. So you have x out, you have x in, I'll say, x in, which should be the same as x out. And then you'll have I out. And that will be the reverse. That'll be like this. Okay, and then the two compensate for each other, right? Now what will happen is, so this would be like, this would be x in to the gamma out, and this will be I to the 1 over gamma in, and hopefully gamma in will equal gamma out. And then everything will be matched. But if the two gammas don't match, let's say gamma out is larger than gamma. Let's say gamma out is smaller. If gamma out is smaller, well, if gamma out is 1, then this would be just a straight line. If this is just a straight line, is the image you're going to view going to be brighter or darker than it should be? It's going to be brighter, right? Because if you make this gamma equals 1, this curve is going to move up and the image is going to look brighter than it should. And that's why Apple chose gammas on their monitors to be 1.1, because it made the images look a little brighter, and they thought that was a good thing at that time. But since then, I think they've adopted the 2.2 standard. Okay? All right? But the point is, so you can use these gammas to control contrast in the image. If you make gamma larger, you'll make the image brighter. If you make gamma smaller, you'll make the image brighter. If you make it larger, you'll make it more contrasty. Okay? Because you'll make the dark regions get darker. But the important thing is you don't want to use gamma equals 1. Gamma equals 1 would be a bad choice. And why is gamma equal 1 a bad choice? Because, well, it does nothing, but what will happen if you use gamma equals 1 in a digital imaging system with 8-bit color resolution? Okay, you'll get contours in the dark regions. Okay, by the way, for this section, you can just remember those words and repeat them back, okay? And then figure out later why it is that they're true, okay? You'll get contours in the dark regions. Why? Because if you don't apply the gamma correction, you're linear in energy. Now, small steps in energy will have very high contrast in dark regions. If you do the gamma correction, what happens here is that, these small changes result in big values of X change. So then you get sort of finer grained steps is what happens. You see? Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so that's the whole deal with gamma correction. Understanding gamma correction is very important because people who don't understand gamma correction are just kind of banging around when they're dealing with images because they don't understand what coordinates the data's in. All right. Okay. And this is just some more. I'll let you go through these slides yourself. Now, visual MTF, or modulation transfer function. If you talk about the MTF of an imaging system, or the human modulation transfer function, usually what they mean is it's sort of like standard nomenclature for your visual frequency response. Okay, so the upshot is that I'm going to tell you the answer, and then I'll explain the details. If you have very high frequency content, it's hard to see, right? So I have glasses, right? Particularly if I take my glasses off, I can't see anything. I'm like blind. Why am I blind? Because everything's fuzzy, right? I'm literally like, I wouldn't pass a basic test for, I can't see anything, basically. I can't even identify who I'm looking at. Like, sometimes if I have my glasses off, I'll get to the beach, and like I'll see somebody who's a friend of mine. They'll think I'm being mean. I'm like, I have no idea who you are, okay? You just look like a blob, okay? Okay? So because I'm nearsighted, right? Which means that if I'm looking at something at a normal distance, my lens can't focus, so the image is completely out of focus, and the effect of that is that the point spread function becomes like a big Gaussian blur. Okay, so I have very little spatial resolution. Okay, so now if I have like I don't know, some fine text. Okay, if I have some fine text, like you guys. Salman, you're way far away. Can you read this? Oh, you can't read it, right? Of course not. Well, I was a little worried that his vision would be so good that he could read it, okay? But of course he can't read it because it's like this fine text, and he's like, I don't know, 30 feet away, okay? Certainly I wouldn't be able to read it, okay? Why can't he read it? If I hold this up close to you, you can read it, right? Or if I put it over here, you can read it, okay? So why is that? Because this is really small and you're far away, right? It's very simple. So the point is this: it's because what happens is that if you have something, okay, so if you have something that's spaced at some distance, we'll call this delta x. But this distance here is very large, d, using a small d. So this is your I. Okay. Oh, that's a noseless person. Okay. I'm trying to provide some entertainment. Okay. So you're looking at this thing from a long distance. That's not Salman because he's much more attractive than that. Okay. So this is a very large distance, right? Now what happens is the angle subtended here is going to be, okay, in delta theta in units of radians is going to be equal to delta x over d, right? Okay? That's the angle in units of radians. And really, that's what's important. Because if I hold this thing, if I was looking at, if I had this thing here, if I had this thing here, right, and it was a billboard, so I took this thing and made it gigantic, okay? But I had it on the road, and you were driving past it, it might be equally about the same difficulty of reading because it's much bigger. Or the reason you can see this over here is because it's displayed up on the screen, which is a lot bigger than my piece of paper. So the important thing isn't the absolute size of the text. It's the relative size, the ratio of this spacing here relative to the distance. If it's very far away, then I need it to be bigger. If it's close, it can be smaller, right? Which is why, like, I always take off my glasses when I have to read, and I hold the thing really close, because then I can see it much better, okay? So, so that makes sense. So if you go through some of the basic mathematics, you can ask yourself, well, how about if we try to measure the frequency response of the visual system? So to measure the frequency response, we're going to first create a sine wave at some frequency, okay? And then we'll create what they call a grating. Now, for an image, the image has to be strictly positive. So it can't go to negative, right? Because you can't have negative light. So what you do is you add a background level, okay? So YB here, delta Y here has to be less than YB, right? Or I guess delta Y here has to be less than YB. No, 2 delta Y has to be less than YB. In any case, delta Y is limited, right? But the ratio of delta Y to YB, that's the contrast, right? Because that's sort of the fractional ratio. So that's the relevant quantity. So the two relevant quantities are the contrast and this the angle subtended. So if you have F0 here has units of cycles per unit distance. So let's say X is measured in inches. Then this will be cycles per inch, right? That will be cycles per inch. But cycles per inch is not necessarily relevant because if the thing is very far away, but it's very large, then it's different than if it's very close. So in order to normalize that, you really want to reconvert the units of F0 to be in cycles per degree, okay? So I'm not even going to go through I'll let you go through the mathematics, but the conversion from cycles per inch to cycles per degree is this. You take F0, which is units of, let's just do it like this so you can see that the units work out. The units working out at least gives you some confidence. So the formula is pi over 180. This is an important formula. It's good to write it down because if you work in this area, you will use it, okay? That F0 has units of cycles per inch, say, right? This has units of inches. So those two things will cancel out, and what you'll get is cycles, okay? And now the other part about it that is a little bit odd is you multiply by pi over 180. That converts to, okay, I won't even try to justify that. Just believe it, okay? Or go through the derivation because it's a little unintuitive, and that's why it's good to write this formula down. But what comes out here is cycles per degree. That's the important thing, okay? I guess maybe you could say this is in degrees, and then that's canceling, that's somehow accounting for the fact that the thing's in radians to start off with, okay? It comes out, and that's the formula. So what you do then is this. You present a stimulus of a grating like this. You adjust the gradient until you get just the noticeable difference. So in other words, you present the gradient, you give the person, like the subject, a clicker in their hand, right? Every time they see the gradient, they click, yes, I see it, okay? Now what you wait until the contrast is such that you can detect it 50% of the time. You can just barely detect it. And then for that particular grading frequency, you plot a point on a curve. So along this axis is what's f tilde 0, and the units here are cycles per degree. Okay, and then what you do is you plot a curve, the contrast ratio. Now, you don't plot the contrast ratio because you actually take 1 over the contrast, the just knows what contrast, because that's the sensitivity. So, the sensitivity is 1 part, and so it's the contrast ratio is like 1 part in 100. Then the sensitivity here would be like 100. So at something you plot that point, and you plot the next point. And then as the frequency goes up, eventually you're going to have trouble seeing it, right? So this is going to go down. And you're going to get a curve that looks like this. Now what's interesting is that, so you get a curve, you get a curve that looks like this. What may be a little surprising is that if the spatial frequency is too low, it's also hard to see it. So what's the intuition behind that? If I present you with let's say I make this gigantic billboard, okay, and you stand relatively close to the billboard so it fills up your entire field of view, okay? It's like you go to an IMAX theater, okay? And then what happens is that on one side of the poster, it's a gray level, but it's a little bit lighter. And on the other side is a gray level, but it's a little bit darker. It will be very difficult for you to distinguish that because the gradation is very slow, okay? And as you look across that field, your visual system adapts because it's very similar to the phenomena that I described earlier, where if I take this piece of paper and I look at it on a sunny day, or I look at it in a dim room, I still see the same piece of paper. So your visual system naturally adapts to changes in the illuminant, either intensity changes or color changes, we'll see later on. So that adaptation will cause your sensitivity to go down at very low spatial frequencies. But mostly we don't care about this because it doesn't have a lot of consequences in terms of how you design imaging systems, okay, for the most part. But it's important to know that it's there. So, and then it'll be flat over a large range, and then it'll start dropping off. And the drop-off starts around 10 cycles per degree. So in a 1 degree subtended angle, if you had like 10 cycles of a grading, okay, that would be about the point where you're reaching the limits of your visual acuity if you have normal corrected vision. So a lot of people have glasses, but if you have corrected vision, that's fine, unless your vision, your aggregate vision will still be pretty close to whatever the average would be for populations. Okay, okay. So that's what happens there. Okay, so now this is very important because in imaging applications, for example, one of the things we'll talk about is image compression. If you do image compression, you don't need to maintain all the very high spatial frequencies here because you can't see them. Another example would be halftoning. Oh shoot, nobody happens to have a magazine with them by any chance, do they? Does anybody have a magazine or a newspaper or anything like that? No, okay, we've really entered into the digital age, I guess. Okay, okay, someone remind me to bring a magazine or a newspaper with me. Because if you have some printed material, gosh, this is like the first time in history where I've reached this point in the class and there has actually been no piece of printed material anywhere within. Okay, it turns out if you get like a newspaper or a magazine, right? Particularly if you take like the front cover of the magazine and you see a picture. It's like a picture of a car. Say, I'll bring in my car and driver magazine. So like the new C8 Corvette, which I kind of think is cool. If anybody gets one, I'd really like to have a ride in one. So the new C8 Corvette, and you zoom in, okay, you'd be like, oh, this is a picture of a car. You zoom in, guess what it looks like? It looks like little dots. It looks like little dots. And in the bright regions of the image, the dots are far apart. And when in the dark regions of the image, the dots are close together. Okay? So in a printer, and we'll talk about this is called halftoning. This is how things are printed. Most printers cannot print continuous tone color. They print either dots on or off. Okay? So that takes advantage of the fact that the frequency, so you say, well, the dots don't look like the image should look like. They're completely different. Yeah, but guess what? If you filter out the high frequencies, they look very similar. So basically, you're creating the illusion of creating an image that matches. It looks like a very high quality reproduction, but it's really formed by little dots, and that you're taking advantage that your spatial frequency response drops off at the high spatial frequencies. Okay? So that's a very important thing. Then there's a thing called image fidelity and quality metrics. This part of there's been a lot of work in image fidelity and quality metrics, and this stuff is, what I'm going to present here is pretty basic, okay? But I may as well the main thing is just to take away that they exist and they're important, okay? So that image fidelity means what? It means that you have two images, the reference image and the reproduced image. So it might be the compressed image from JPEG. It might be the video sequence that you're going to display on Netflix. It might be the halftone image, okay, that you're going to print, and you want that image to match some reference, some ideal reference. So those are fidelity metrics that tell you how accurately something matches some like absolute reference. By the way, has anybody ever heard of a hi-fi audio, right? Hi-fi. They still talk about hi-fi audio, right? It's sort of like a small group of hardy souls that won't give up. Okay, so so that's referring to fidelity. A high fidelity audio system is supposed to reproduce the audio so it sounds exactly like the original reference sound. So you put the microphones on the stage at the Met or wherever it is. I don't know, someplace, and then they have the symphony orchestra plays, and you record the sound, and then it gets reproduced in your home, and it sounds exactly like it did there. Okay, that's the concept. Okay, similarity. Okay, quality is very different. So now here's the thing: you can have an image. The image could look really bad in the sense that a person would look at it and they'd say, "Wow, that doesn't look very good." And here's a very clear, objective way of determining if they think the image looks bad. They don't want to pay for it, okay? So in other words, you sell them the image like it's a picture that you printed at, say, Walgreens, and you don't want to print pictures. You don't want to pay for pictures that you think look bad. Now you say, well, that's just my opinion. Well, yeah, it's just your opinion, but if you don't like it, you're not going to pay for it because you don't have to, okay? So there you don't just want images that look like they have high fidelity. You want images that have high quality, okay? Quality is much more difficult than fidelity because it's completely subjective. That doesn't mean it can't be reproducible. It can, but it's harder to measure, okay? So quality is very important. Actually, for people who produce images, quality is actually in many cases more important than fidelity, okay? And then there's similarity. That's like if you're doing like databases or something. But we'll talk a little bit about fidelity, but not really about quality. In fidelity, okay, so how do you measure the fidelity? So in this case, the reference image may not have high quality, but you want to match it. You want it to look exactly the same, for good or for bad. Okay, so now the problem is that with gamma correction, there's two issues, okay? You have to take into account the fact that high spatial frequencies are not as important as low, but you also have to take into account that the gamma correction gives uniform things. So it's a tricky issue. The low-pass filtering needs to occur in the linear domain with energy, and we'll talk about why that is later. But then usually you apply the gamma correction second, and then you use mean square error after that. So this is essentially what LAB does, not LAB, in any case, this is sort of a basic measure of image quality. that you might use in an application space, okay? Next time we're going to start with color imaging, okay? And we're out of time now, so I'll see you. Have a nice weekend. The weather should be nice. Bye.